So I'd like to welcome Professor Salimul Haq, who is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. So we're very fortunate to have the professor here with us today because he is an expert on locally led adaptation, and he has vast experience in mitigation, adaptation, sustainable development. What's interesting about the professor is that he was the lead author on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th IPCC assessment reports. So he has a lot of experience when it comes to the IPCC. We have some questions about that. He's a professor at the Independent University in Bangladesh. He's also an associate at the International Institute on Environment and Development, chair of the expert advisory group on the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and of course, a senior advisor on locally led adaptation for the Global Center on Adaptation, the sponsor of this workshop that we're taking right now. He has contributed to reports of the IPCC that received a 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, and amongst other awards, a National Environment Award from Bangladesh in 2020. He's published hundreds of scientific as well as popular articles. Some of them you actually read during your lunch hour. Remember, I shared with you some opinion pieces that he wrote for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and is recognized as among the top 20 global influencers on climate change policy in 2019. More recently, he was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire in the 2022 New Year honors for services to combating international climate change. So, everybody, I'm going to stop that sharing right now, and I'm going to welcome the professor to our group today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Darren, and very nice to be with all of you. Would you be willing, if you don't mind, to put your name and your country or affiliation in the chat box so I get a sense of who's here while I talk? And apologize in advance for having a bit of a sore throat, which is a remnant of COVID that I caught a few months ago. That seems to be continuing, unfortunately. Congratulations to all of you for having been selected for this Thomson Reuters Foundation fellowship and for your interest in learning more about locally led adaptation. I'm assuming you've been reasonably well briefed about it by now. So I won't start from the basics. I'll take the story forward in terms of where I feel the issue of locally led adaptation is scientifically and politically, and where we might look for the future, and particularly for stories that, as journalists, you might want to focus on. So the first stage, I will say, the foundation for locally led adaptation has now been achieved over the last couple of years. And I will attribute this to an initiative called the Global Commission on Adaptation, which ran for a couple of years with under the chairmanship or co-chairmanship of former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva from at that time, CEO of the World Bank. She's now the head of the IMF. And they had a number of very eminent commissioners from all over the world. They ran it for a year and a half with a lot of consultations, and it was focusing on adaptation. And it ended up with a major adaptation report and a summit with 8 different adaptation tracks identified. One of those tracks was on locally led adaptation. And a couple of the commissioners, particularly the head of BRAC, which is a Bangladesh-based NGO, but the biggest NGO in the world. It's an international NGO called BRAC. The head of the BRAC at that time was a gentleman called Dr. Musa. He was one of the commissioners. And also the head of the Slum Dwellers International, Sheila Patel, was another commissioner, and I was working with them very closely, and we developed the locally led adaptation track of one of the 8 tracks of the Global Commission. And around the locally led adaptation track, we brought together, it was coordinated jointly by the World Resources Institute, which is headquartered in Washington, and the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, based in London, with whom I'm very closely associated. I used to work there. I don't work there anymore, but I'm still closely associated with them. And under the guidance of these 2 secretariats, it developed a set of 8 principles, which I'm sure you're familiar with already, for locally led adaptation. And these principles went through a lot of discussion and refinement, finally got agreed. And then these principles were then solicited and advocated for adoption by various groups, countries, national governments. A number of national governments adopted them. Donors like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank, UNDP, bilateral donors like FCDO from the UK, GIZ from Germany, etc. And so now I think well over 50, possibly 60 plus organizations have adopted the 8 principles of locally led adaptation. And last year in the COP, in the 26th COP, or COP26, held in Glasgow, it became a major part of the broader issue of adaptation. So what happened in Glasgow was that adaptation in general, a broad adaptation, was acknowledged to have been under-resourced by the international global community. The finance for tackling climate change was supposed to have been $100 billion a year from the developed world to the developing world. They never reached 100 billion. They still haven't reached 100 billion. But whatever they reached, which was in the order of maybe 70 or so billion, the vast majority of that money went for mitigation. 80% went for supporting mitigation actions, and only 20% went for supporting adaptation actions. And the vulnerable developing countries made a big issue of this, saying that wasn't fair. They wanted 50-50. They didn't mind half the money going to mitigation, but they wanted half of it to come to adaptation. And that was actually a successful advocacy, because the developed countries acknowledged they hadn't given enough for adaptation. They promised to double the amount they were going to give to adaptation, and they are now in the process of fulfilling that promise. We don't know for sure how much they'll come up with, but we'll know by the time we get to COP27 in Egypt. So that's a major victory in terms of getting the whole world, and particularly the developed countries, to acknowledge that adaptation needed a lot more support, and they promised to give it a lot more support. Now, that's a good thing. However, in the latest report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which Darren just referred to, the report of Working Group 2, which is on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation, which came out at the end of February this year, they had some very interesting analysis of the investments that have gone into adaptation so far. And there hasn't been adequate investment, but there has been some. And researchers have been able to evaluate some of those investments. And a very interesting result has come out of that research, which has been published in the IPCC Working Group 2 report, which is that quite a lot of the adaptation funding has been useful, but a very significant amount has not been useful, not particularly effective in the end. And in some cases, minority, but some cases, the investment made for adaptation not only was not useful, it actually ended up making things worse. And we now have a term in the climate change science world called maladaptation. So instead of improving things, it made things worse. And this was not intentional. This was unintentional consequences. And the researchers who evaluated these kinds of projects had a number of reasons. They found a number of reasons, but there was one very common reason across all of them, which was that in almost all the cases that they looked at where these investments fell short, the investment itself was done in a very top-down manner, either by national governments or by international agencies like the World Bank or the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank or UNDP. And it was designed by so-called quote-unquote experts, international experts, who flew into the country with a pre-designed adaptation program or investment plan and implemented it and asked the local people to just simply implement it and told them that this is going to be good for them. After implementation, it turned out not to be as good as they had thought it would be. And so the biggest single deficiency that was identified by the researchers was the lack of consultation with local people. This very top-down, we know best approach to local people's problems, which gets manifested in terms of even terminology that's used. People are the targets or the beneficiaries. They are not the implementers. They are not the people designing things. They are recipients of ideas and fund from others, and they just have to do what they're told. And the research findings was that this was very misplaced, because the local people are the ones who are suffering the problem and are much more able to identify what needs to be done. And as they say, he whose shoe pinches knows how it and where it pinches. Somebody else cannot say where the shoe is pinching. And so you need to talk to the people themselves and get their ideas and inputs into designing, and that it recognizes what we have been advocating about, locally led adaptation. So involving the local communities in not just helping to design the adaptation interventions, but also to implement them, and even more importantly, going forward, to evaluate their success. At the moment, evaluation of success is determined by the donors. Whoever gives the money sends an evaluator after the project is over to evaluate whether the project was done well or not. And the criteria is always value for money. We gave you, $500, $1,000, $5,000, $100 million, whatever we gave you, show us what you did with that. And if we don't like what you did with it, then we're going to declare your project a failure. It's a very top-down, donor-driven evaluation world that we live in. This is the world we live in. And we, in the locally led adaptation community, we argue that the arbiters and evaluators need to be the communities themselves. The people who are supposed to be helped to adapt need to evaluate whether or not it helped us or not, whether we are better off now than we were before. And within the research community of locally led adaptation, which is a subset of the broader adaptation research community, we focus a lot of our attention, we belong to that community, on the monitoring, evaluation, and accountability and learning. There are two additional letters to the traditional M and E, which is very donor driven, monitoring and evaluation. The donors evaluate, as I said, on the basis of how their money was spent. but we add an A for accountability, and we our view of accountability is downward accountability of the donor to the people, which is opposite to what happens normally, and learning. The L is extremely important because adaptation is quintessentially a learning by doing process. And unless you do things, you won't learn to adapt. And when you do things, you don't know in advance what's going to work and what's not going to work. So you will make mistakes. So learning from mistakes, acknowledging mistakes, learning from mistakes is inherently a good thing in the adaptation domain. And again, that's something that is not very well endorsed by donors. They don't like giving money to do experiments. They want to give money to have something that we know is going to work. But with adaptation to climate change, we don't know if it's going to work. It might work, it might not work. We'll have to test and see. And so adaptation interventions and activities have an element of they might work, they might not work. We need to try many different things, see what works, and then do more of what works. And if something doesn't work, we don't do more of it, or we find a better way to do it so that we correct the mistakes. So mistakes are good as long as you learn from mistakes. Mistakes are bad if you don't acknowledge them and you keep repeating them. And that is our view of how to evaluate locally led adaptation. Now, I mentioned already that many organizations have accepted this principle that they did things wrong, they need to do it better, they need to have a much more bottom-up approach. They sign on to the 8 principles, which is a good thing. So now where we are is ensuring that they actually practice what they claim to be doing. And that is an opportunity for journalists like yourselves to hold them to account. And one opportunity or one group that my institute is involved in that might be of interest to you is called Gobeshona. Gobeshona is a Bangla word for research, and it is a platform of both practitioners and researchers working on locally led adaptation. We started off in Bangladesh, but we've now gone global. And every year, in the first quarter of the year, we hold a major international conference on locally led adaptation. And we did the first one last year, the second one this year. Before that, we did an in-person conference in Bangladesh, largely focused on Bangladesh. But because of COVID, we couldn't do the in-person last year. We did it online. And because we were online, we reached out to friends across the world, and we got a huge response. And so we ran it 24 hours a day for 7 days. For first 8 hours in the Asia Pacific region, second 8 hours in the Africa, Europe time zone, third 8 hours in the Americas time zone, and then went around the world 7 days in a row with nearly 100 sessions. And we got a tremendous response from all over the world, sessions from every place. Incidentally, adaptation, locally led adaptation is happening everywhere, even in the rich countries, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Canada, in America. And so it's a global phenomenon, not just a developing country phenomenon anymore. And a growing community of practice that are involved in it, who share their knowledge and experience with each other. And we did it again this year, again, similarly around just under 100 sessions over 7 days. I can share the links to the conference if you want to have a look at any of them. We're producing a series of outputs from this year's conference at the moment, which we hope to publish and disseminate at the COP this year in Egypt in November. And we'll be holding next year's conference in the first quarter of 2023. And we'd be very happy for all of you to participate. And if you want to write stories about what's happening on any of the activities that will be shared and presented there. So one of the things that we hope, this is an annual conference, beginning of each year. The theme, incidentally, for this year's conference was connecting the local to the global, particularly focusing on COP27. So in each of the sessions that we had, local groups talking about what they were doing, we asked them to conclude with a message for COP27 in Egypt. And we've pulled those together. And as I said, we'll be taking them to COP27 in Egypt in November, where there'll be quite a large number of side events and activities going on where people working on locally led adaptation will come together. There are a couple of pavilions, one called the Resilience Hub, and another one, there's a locally led adaptation hub as well. There was one last year in COP 26, and there'll be another one in COP 27, where we get together and share what we're doing physically and sometimes in hybrid form, including people who weren't able to go to the COP. And so that will take place later this year. And then next year, when we hold it, we are going to be focusing on the accountability aspect. As I said, many organizations are now claiming that they will adopt this new practice. I'm sure I have no reason to doubt that they want to do it, but how well they do it in practice remains to be seen. And that's where I think the role of journalists like yourselves is extremely important, to be able to visit places, talk to people, particularly the local people, talk to the project implementers, the project donors, the funders, and give an objective view of what works and what doesn't work. And as I said, reality is always imperfect. Some things will work, some things will not work. And one of our principles is to accept that not everything is or will be perfect, but acknowledge mistakes and learn from mistakes. And that the role of the journalist is to find those mistakes and bring them to attention of a wider segment of the population. Some might like that, some might not like that, but that is a genuine positive activity to add to generating new knowledge on how to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Now, before I end, let me talk a little bit about what's happening now and where are we headed. What's happening now is interesting in that one of the other important findings of the sixth assessment report of the IPCC is that they now have said for the very first time that they have unequivocal evidence of human-induced climate change impacts happening. They're happening now, right now, as we speak. You know, there's a heat wave in China, the river Yangtze has dried up. The heat wave in Europe, the river Rhine has dried up. In Bangladesh, we just had a 1 in 100 year flood a few weeks ago, and India is having a major flood right now as we speak. These impacts are happening every day somewhere in the world. There is a huge climatically induced impact that is now attributable to human-induced climate change. The flood or the heat wave is not happening because of climate change, but it's a lot worse than it otherwise would be because global temperature has already gone above 1 degree, attributable to human-induced climate change. So we are now already suffering the impacts of climate change, and therefore we have entered what I call the era of loss and damage from climate change. It's happening. People are suffering the impacts of climate change. And if you follow the international negotiations in the COP, you will know that this topic is a very hot topic. It's a politically sensitive topic. The rich developed countries don't like talking about it. We, the vulnerable developing countries, push for having a finance facility for loss and damage in Glasgow. We didn't get it. We got instead a dialogue on a finance facility for 3 years. So the rich countries offered to talk about it for 3 years, but not to give any money for 3 years. I mean, that's not acceptable. So we are pushing for it to come up again in COP27. Interestingly, loss and damage isn't a standing agenda item every COP. So we said it must be. And in COP27, right now, loss and damage, finance for loss and damage is on the provisional agenda. It's not approved yet. And at the very beginning of COP27, we will have a fight about whether to adopt this agenda item or not adopt it. And any countries that oppose it, because decisions are made by consensus, it won't go through. But if it fails to go through, the vulnerable developing countries in particular will declare COP27 a failure before it even starts officially. So this is going to be a big issue for you reporters to keep an eye on. It's going to be a big fight at the very beginning of COP27 in Egypt. And right now, a lot of maneuvering and discussions going on as to how to avoid that fight and what would be a compromise that everybody could live with. So going forward, the locally led adaptation world is now segueing in many places to the locally loss and damage world. You know, they are now suffering the impacts of climate change, and the adaptation they were doing either failed or wasn't as effective as it ought to have been. And so we have this new phenomena of loss and damage emerging, which links to locally led adaptation. And adaptation is done in anticipation of the problem to minimize the impacts. But once they happen, then the impacts have happened. And the story is about the impacts and the losses and damages that people are suffering or countries are suffering. And so I would, and my research in my center has shifted very significantly. We still do a lot of work on LLA, but we are now shifting to LLD, local loss and damage, and developing knowledge based on it. It's a new subject. We don't have much information. We don't have a lot of data, but it's happening. So something even journalists can follow and provide information on. So something to keep in mind. If any of you have an interest in developing your interest in loss and damage, please do feel free to get in touch with me. I'll be happy to follow up with you and help you in any way I can.
The desert fight scene is a staple of most cinema industries in India. It's of course the good guy smashing the living daylights out of the bad guys in the desert. But I'd advise you to focus on the desert, which I will then explain to you what is so special about this desert. So Darren, I'm going to do the share screen.
Yes, so we've made you co-host. Perfect. There it is.
Just a second. Here we are. Get back to the first page where we have these clippings. India has a large desert zone up in Rajasthan, the Thar desert area. All these do exist there. But this desert is special. Here we go. Well, the thing about that desert,
ఎవరి ఆఫీస్ లో వాళ్ళు కూర్చొని ఎన్నైనా మాట్లాడొచ్చు, పడనోళ్ళని ఎన్నైనా
Sorry.
తిట్టొచ్చు. అవినీతి చేసిండ్రని
That-
పబ్లిక్
it's-
పట్టించుకుంటలేరని
Sorry, who is?
ఏదంటే అది మాట్లాడొచ్చు.
sorry.
కానీ అసెంబ్లీలో అట్లా కాదు, ఫేస్ టు ఫేస్.
Oh dear, sorry about that.
Oh, that was the video.
It went on to further stuff which we don't need. I thought I had quit the sharing, but apparently not. Just give me a moment to get out of that mess. And
That's okay. That's all right. That's a beautiful desert.
yeah, well, the thing about the desert is that it wasn't a desert. And have I got out of the sharing mode? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
The thing about the desert is that it's in deep southern peninsular tropical India. And 50 years ago, it was an ocean of millets, millet cultivation, and people grew 9 different kinds of millets over there. They then, you know, there's an expression in the ancient Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote of the laying waste of Scotland by the Roman army. And he concluded by saying, they made a desert and they called it peace. We made a desert and we called it development. What we did was to shift from the millets, which, by the way, are the most nutritious stuff that you can come by, native to the soil, grown there thousands of years, and replaced it with an external species of groundnut. It's not that there was no groundnut in this area called Anantapur in Rayalaseema, the Rayalaseema region, but we brought in these hybrids and stuff from outside. And the groundnut did to this area very much what it did in the Sahel. It simply removed every trace of forest cover, of everything. And this is today a desert. It's a couple of thousand acres, but spreading. Yeah. Now, the thing about the fight scene is that in the southern film industry, when they did their fight scenes, they had to travel 1,200 kilometers to northwest Rajasthan in India, in India's northwest, put up at luxury hotels for their stars and, you know, spend a week there. Now, it takes them a few hours to drive down because it's very close to the big cities of Chennai and Bangalore. They can do their shooting in the daytime and go back home at night, sleep in their own beds. Right. And the entire region is a wasteland of groundnut. Yeah. And the devastation it's had on water, on climate, on the kinds of irrigation systems we had to bring in, which we really didn't have to for the millets, which were native and did very well on rainfall, you know, rain-fed irrigation, and they didn't need that much water as groundnut does. So that is what I wanted to share with you people as an example of what for us, that story was a way of telling the story of what is happening under climate change and the role of human agency in precipitating the crisis. Now, I am decidedly not about to lecture you guys on climate change and climate science, and you will find that as boring and repetitive as I do. What I'm going to try telling you is that in the People's Archive of Rural India, the team, including myself, that story which on the desert, that was the first story of our climate series, starting 2019. And I shot that story and did the story. We'll look at it soon. So I'm not going to lecture you on climate change. I'm just going to talk to you about what we as reporters have learned, have still to learn, and have unlearned about what the heck is happening with the climate crisis. The very first thing I suppose I should say is that we approach this. We have learned to approach it as a very fundamental human rights and survival issue. Okay, I think we sort of agree with the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He no longer holds that post, but Philip Alston, when he was the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, summed it up in one line at the end of his report. Human rights may not survive the coming crisis of climate upheaval. In fact, he spoke of something which is unfolding before our eyes. It's called, what he called the movement towards climate apartheid, where the rich pay to escape heat and hunger, and the rest suffer the impacts of the climate crisis. That is, in fact, aggravated by the process of the rich building their private defenses. In fact, I understand that one of you here is from Jakarta. You would know a lot better than me about how a whole city can be abandoned. When they say they're going to shift a city, shift a capital, you know very well who's going to get left behind, who's not going to be accommodated in the new arrangements. So we see this as a very fundamental human rights and survival issue, which has a very serious impact on the rights, the livelihoods, the survival of poor and marginalized communities the world around. In India, there is something like 15 agroclimatic zones, and within those, some microclimatic zones. This makes it a very, very complex country and geography to cover. In fact, the first National Commission on Agriculture in 1971 divided the country into, they found that they had 127 agroclimatic zones. But if we ignore the microclimatic zones, we are there with about 15 major agroclimatic zones. And point 3, we have something like 20 odd agroecological zones. Now, PARI is the People's Archive of Rural India. Our acronym is PARI, our climate change reporting project. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you, as a fellow reporter and journalist, the stuff we are doing, some of the things which I think are pretty unique, and how we go about it. Our project comes from multiple agroecological zones and over 30 regions and sub-regions. Absolutely incredible diversity in the regions. But the difference in our approach is all our climate stories are based on and foreground the voices and lived experience of ordinary people. All our stories are told through the lives of farmers, laborers, fisherfolk, nomadic pastoralists, seaweed harvesters, honey collectors, insect trappers, and more. And in the process, we are covering fragile mountainous ecosystems, forests, seas, coastal urban areas, coastal rural areas, coral islands, deserts, arid, semi-arid zones, you name it. Now, a few things which we do and which I would strongly advise people to go about is while foregrounding ordinary voices. Science and scientists are very much there in our stories. However, India's top climate scientists concur with our approach that there are many lessons to be learned from the lived experience of ordinary people directly in the line of climate impact. I'll give you many examples of that when we go to the presentation we have. Now, what do you and I do as journalists? What is the thing we bring to the table here? One of the things we do, part of our job, in working with specialists and experts in the field, it often becomes our task as journalists to translate the experts into languages spoken by human beings. The same as we often have to do with economists, right? The jargon, the terminology. Take the IPCC reports, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, these reports are vital. Some of them pack libraries worth of information, and getting beyond the first 50 pages is a serious challenge to anyone's sanity. So we do work with report, quote the scientists, and we look for practical manifestations in the field of what they're talking about. But we de-jargonize and do not foreground them in our stories. It seems to be somewhat silly to get out into the most inaccessible or remote regions of fragile mountainous ecosystems at 19,000 feet above sea level, and then center the scientists and not the local nomadic pastoralists whom we are staying with over there. Now, the next problem, which I think journalists will recognize quite easily, in conventional media coverage, that is another word for corporate media, the climate change coverage has become too abstract and jargonized. The process seems far removed from our readers' lives. Surveys that have been done show us that people associate climate change sitting in a South Asian hotspot of climate change. The middle class readers, for instance, their immediate association of idea when they come to climate change is the melting of the Antarctic sheet, or the gutting of the Amazon forest, or bushfires in Australia, or in terms of boring intergovernmental meetings. Now, Paris climate reporting tries to get audiences to recognize, and it's essentially a reporting project, tries to get audiences to recognize and locate the problem as much closer to and increasingly embedded in their own lives. The first 25 of the stories on this project, the United Nations Development Program is publishing the full collection as a photo book. Now, what is it that we do that we would invite others to do? Or I'm not saying that others aren't doing it. I'm just saying for us, this is the central focal point of an article of faith, if you will. We tell our stories through the lives of people, especially marginalized communities, those worst affected by the climate crisis. We try telling them as far as possible through the voices and lived experience of those people. We have second point for all reporters to know. We have found that it is rather foolish to assume that we are going out into the field armed with a knowledge very superior to that of those we are covering. Now, the communities you run into, work with, and the communities I run into and work with, they may not ever use the words climate change, but many of them have often experienced it more vividly and more profoundly than any of us ever has. For instance, in some places and communities like coastal fisherfolk, they will speak to you in terms of extreme weather events and how those have multiplied in a relatively short period of time. I mean, we get a lot on this from people in the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest, 4/5 of it in Bangladesh, 1/5 of it in India. And the state in which it is located, the state of West Bengal, it's seen more than 70 cyclonic storms, major cyclonic storms in a century. In one count, 105 in 125 years. But a gigantic number of them are concentrated in the last 4 decades. Now, people in the Sundarbans have a lot to tell us about what they experience as extreme weather information that we'd be very foolish to discount. But our job, information we as journalists need to convert into stories that bring alive the issue to your readers. In some places and regions, people speak to us of huge changes in agricultural yields with a depth and understanding that would shame many of the agro-scientists. And many of our scientist friends are surprised by how many illiterate people are able to make linkages between those developments, the change in agricultural yields, and changes in cropping patterns and technologies. So yes, please know that the people you hope to cover have a wealth of information and knowledge to offer that is not to be scoffed at. Now I'm going to share screen and go over a few of the stories that tell you about them, and maybe take you into the story also for a picture. Yeah, so here we go. This is the first one is the story of the desert. Yeah, so the dramatic expressiveness of ordinary people, like when we went to this desertified area, which you saw in the film, we asked them what are things like. They said, oh yeah, okay. It's just that it's raining sand. And the raining sand meant that every household, every house in this village has a mesh gate in front of the door to stop the dust. And each and every single door with that mesh was full of mud and dirt, because you actually had gigantic sandstorms. Now, by the way, the seed companies have got into the act. Now, what actually happened here? In the district called Anantapur, where the millets, it was the millets basket of southern India. Not only when you bring the borewell, when you bring the groundnut, a cash crop, as against the millets, which are food crops, native, hardy, climate resilient, require less water. You then start having to create so much irrigation that you sink tens of thousands of bore wells. Now the bore wells here, a technical committee in 2018 declared that the load-bearing capacity of this district was a 70,000 bore wells. If you exceed that, they said that you're in big trouble. The year I covered it, in 2019, there were an estimated 300,000 bore wells in that district with a borewell bearing capacity of 70,000 max. Now that destroyed water for all the other plantations, for all the other cultivation in that district. And that's how you have the desert coming about. Okay. Now, what happens is that the water still comes in one particular area because it's the bed of a now dead river. Yeah. So you can still sink, they're still sinking bore wells at the rate of 3 per acre. And seed companies have got in and got people to grow these hybrids for them from which they can get seeds. Basically, they're seed nurseries for large seed corporations. This is, if you look at this particular thing, the day before we came there was crop on that soil and completely covered over in one evening's sandstorm. And she is one of those people who comes here, collects water, cultivates here, a very poor woman from that village. So this is what happened to what was once the government decided and sent a high-level team of experts in an armed with an SUV, 4-wheel drive, to get in to study the desert. The humiliation of it all, when their luxury SUV got stuck in the desert sands and had to be rescued by bullock carts. The villagers went in with bullock carts and pulled out your 4-wheel drive SUV from there and sent the officers back to their air-conditioned offices. Okay. So, I mean, this is the kind of stuff. And, you know, each and every one of these people lived in a period when they were growing millets, when they still had a lot of millets. They understand the connections. They just feel trapped, that they don't have options. How are we now going to go back to millets? How are we going to reverse our cultivation process? Frankly, they don't have an answer and neither do we. But at least it's a warning of what you need to not do in the rest of that region, right? So okay. This is a story on an ox misnamed as a buffalo. It is the largest bovine creature in the world. The male Gore buffalo, so to speak, stands at 6 feet 4 inches on average. Yeah, the shoulder. And it's a rare animal, endangered animal. It's in 2-3 parts of India. And in the area where they are now, the climate, which is their natural habitat for them, has seen phenomenal droughts and gigantic floods. And they come out, and they're increasingly coming out into the open and destroying crop because they have to eat something. And their forest has been destroyed by mining activity, drilling activity, you name it. Their forest is gone. This is the largest bovine creature on Earth and an endangered species. Yeah. Now, the process we follow is that the reporter does as much homework as she or he can before they visit the place. And by the way, be prepared on spending time in that place to do a different story from the one you went for. Sometimes people will point out something far more interesting. In fact, our buffalo story came about that way. We'd gone for something on the forest and found the buffalo. And we ran into farmers who were complaining. They said, I mean, what, by the way, the farmers are very understanding. They blame the forest department and not the buffalo. They understand that. And they also say, please understand what it is to see 50 to 100 of these creatures standing on your plot. Yeah, 50 creatures 6 feet and above, weighing tons. I mean, it's quite frightening. It's quite chilling. And that allowed us to tell a story through the experience of those farmers and tell as far as possible the story of the buffalo itself. Now, these are an incredibly endangered community. They're called the Changpas. You know, your Kashmir shawls, your Kashmir sweaters. This is who gives you your Kashmir sweaters. It's those animals and their goats that grow the Kashmir wool, their goats. Now they're saying that with the warming of the mountains, the Kashmir, the goats, the animals, the livestock that grows Kashmir wool, they are yielding much thinner milk and they are growing much thinner fur, much thinner hair. And therefore, that's going to reflect, they say, it's already reflecting in the quality of the wool they harvest from these animals. Yeah, believe it or not, and I know it's very hard to believe, these guys are looking after livestock they're grazing livestock at 19,000 feet above sea level. And that is a fantastic story of climate change and climate crisis. Now, it seems insane, doesn't it? Why would anyone be grazing livestock at 19,000? By the way, they were always grazing livestock at between 9,000 and 14,000 feet. Yeah, because the yak, your yak, is a very, very astonishing creature. Believe me, minus 30 degrees, and the yak hangs around, is actually having a fun day out. The yak will survive very well at minus 30. Of course, it will be a bit painful if it continues, but minus 30, they don't seem to fear it. The same creature, if the temperature crosses plus 15 degrees, it's in serious trouble, and plus 20 degrees in the northeastern state of Sikkim has seen 250 to 300 yak die within a week. The heat is too much for them. 15 degrees plus is just impossible. Now, when these animals, historically, their grazing pattern was, as the summer came, they went from 9,000 feet above sea level up to about 13,000, 14,000 feet for grazing. We're talking about the Western Himalayas. Okay, it's cold. Now they get a little more greenery and stuff, and they go and graze between that 9,000 and 14,000 feet. Now, the mountains have started warming. The mountains have started warming. I don't know how your take on this is, but I think climate change is a cop-out term. Yeah, a compromise, which all of us have gone and accepted. Basically, a compromise foisted on us by the fossil fuel and energy industries, when really we should be talking about global warming. That's what we should be talking about. Now, as this warming continues, the mountains are also getting warmer. The yak cannot survive at 9,000 feet. They cannot. So as the summer comes, they're taking the yak higher and higher until this group of people have touched 90,000 feet. Now, please understand this transhumance migration is a bloody complex and very risky and dangerous thing. How many livestock die on the route of the migrations? How many people are risking their lives, getting up into crevasses and, running the gauntlet of all kinds of risks in the ascent to the mountain. But the livestock are going higher and higher and higher for grazing because of climate. Again, by our photographer lived with them, stayed with them, made the migration, at least part of the migrant journey with them, and was able to tell a beautiful story, of horrible word to use to say beautiful, but to tell a powerful story of climate crisis through their everyday lives. That's why we say it's like a mantra for us. Tell your stories through the lives of people, through their voices and lived experience. Now, in the other extreme of this is from the northern extreme, the Western Himalayas, the southern extreme of India, in Kerala, which grows the best Robusta coffee, not Arabica, but the best varieties of Robusta coffee come from here. And they are reeling in the mountains of the Western Ghats from a rise in temperatures, erratic rainfall. I have worked a lot in this district, and it was called the air-conditioned district because it's had such pleasant, lovely climate, perfect for coffee growing. Absolutely perfect for coffee growing. Now the coffee industry is in the doldrums. People are in the doldrums, people who were much better off. These were not marginalized poor farmers. These were farmers who were doing much better than many of their contemporaries. It's all in the pot. And they also recognize that it's changing for the worse, and people are working on it. Scientific institutions have set up base there to see what they can do, but it is affecting the coffee, the quality of the coffee, and the quantity of the harvest as well. Oh, I love this particular story. Again, it tells you, please notice that in every case, whether with the yak or whatever, I'm going to show you how people are trying to cope, their survival strategies, they cope. Would you believe that this bunch, that little boy, he's not a little boy, he's 14, 15. These are from the fishing community on the Pamban island of the southern tip of India, one of the southern tips, Tamil Nadu's Ramanathapuram district. You know what they're advertising? This group of people, fisher folk, on their own initiative, have set up a radio station to understand, engage with, grapple with issues of global warming, the warming of the seas. Remember, they are fishermen, and they are very severely affected by a large number of things that's happening to them. The warming of the seas, the roughness of the seas. So they've actually created and he is advertising, the banner he's holding is for their radio station, Kadalosai, which means the voice of the waves, the sound of the sea or voice of the waves, whichever you please. Now, in interviewing people for this story, our reporter had some incredible experiences. These are a very, very knowledgeable, if illiterate, community, educated by experience. So we are talking to a very old fisherwoman she's in her 60s. And she was giving us the history of how many different channels there were in the sea and how many different species of fish would be in which channel. So she rattled off some 30, 40 species of fish. Then she rattled off another 10 or 12 And she said, okay, these fish would you normally school in this channel of the sea. Those species would normally school in that channel of the sea. And then she told us, and today, if we have to find those species, we're going to have to look for them on Discovery Channel. She said that's the only place you're going to find those. That's the only channel you're going to find those fish on. Right. Again, I mean, I'm not taking you through every story, but you can see the wonderful thing about this radio station is that the RJs are all practicing fishermen. They are practicing fishermen. So sometimes they even do recordings on their boats. Yeah, I think this is simply splendid. How much more advanced the communities are on this problem than we as journalists are. And I really think a little humility is in order over here, right? So that is, oops. Just a second, please. Yeah. So this is a place called, this is a permanent rain shadow, a terribly drought-stricken place where every year now, people and government have to create gigantic cattle camps because the cattle are starving and also dying of thirst. So you have to create these giant camps to look after them. And, in the last 20 years, you can mark the changes in the cropping patterns, in the harvest, in what kind of products are being used and what kind of technologies. Now here is another result of the kind of fooling around with technologies and exotic crops and stuff. This is in the state where I am based. I'm now talking to you from Mumbai state, which is the capital city of the state of Maharashtra, 120 million people strong state. Now, this area, which is a very, very hot area, year after year, is seeing hailstorms at 43 degrees Celsius. And the bloody hail is as big as golf balls. It has killed livestock. Every year we are covering the death of livestock from, the main press is covering in small paragraphs how many sheep died, how many goats died, how many cattle died as a result of what the heck are we doing with hailstorms at 43 degrees Celsius? Yeah, I think again, that gave us a lead in to reporting things through the lives of people, what they were growing, what they think is happening, and what they think is happening is extremely important to your story. And usually, they come out with phenomenal insights. Now back to our Himalayans, but this is the Eastern Himalayas, and these are people who in trying to adapt have done some astonishing things. Incidentally, this little animal following the farmer uphill, it's not his dog, it's not his faithful dog, it's a baby yak, and it thinks the farmer is his mother, so it's following him. It's a very, very small baby yak. Now, as I said, the yak is a terrific creature, but as it gets warmer, the yak is in big trouble. What have the Brokpas? This community is called Brokpas. The Western Himalayan guys are called Changpas. The Brokpas have used an existing system, an existing species, to try and offset the disaster. Okay, what they've done is they're hybriding animals, crossing the yak with highland cattle called Kot. By crossing yak and Kot, highland cattle, you get a creature called zomo. And you can see the zomo. The zomo has many of the traits of highland cattle, which means it's much more resilient to higher temperatures, much higher temperatures. At the same time, there are problems in the sense that the male zomo cannot reproduce, etc., etc. All those issues come up. But here are a group, an ancient nomadic pastoral community who tell us, look, the zomos have been around, but in recent decades, we have started breeding them in much larger numbers because it offers us some protection and insurance, since these animals are incredibly more resilient to under higher temperatures. Again, these are guys who go up to 17, 18,000 feet with their animals. All this is at about 17,000 feet with their horses, which are also very, very hardy conditioned mountain horses. So, so there you are. The Brokpas, again, like their Western Himalayan counterparts, and please understand that no communities are more endangered, more threatened than fishing communities and nomadic pastoralists. India is home to perhaps the largest number of nomadic pastoralist groups within one country. And okay, this is the Sundarbans, which I told you about. Famous for the Sundarbans tiger, the Bengal tiger, and also the largest mangroves in the world. Would you believe, I mean, this in one estimate, 105 cyclones in 125 years have hit this coast. Not all of them hit the Sundarbans, but have hit this coast. And every year, imagine that your house, your school is uprooted. Life is becoming impossible. And yet, you're going to see a retreat into climate apartheid as the rich try to block some zones of the Sundarbans for tourism and the pleasure of travel and trying to see a tiger, etc. Now, this is another group of nomadic pastoralists. Every year, this community, this is in the desert regions of Kutch in Gujarat. There are nomadic pastoralists in the mountainous ecosystems. There are people in the arid zones, fully arid zones. Now, this community, they travel with 14, 15, sometimes with hundreds of camels, sometimes with a flock of up to 300, 500 sheep. And they gave us a great insight into how the collapse of the market for wool in the world has destroyed them, because everyone is into acrylic and other substitutes. Now, these guys do an 800-kilometer migrational circuit every single year of their lives. They're going through desert zones, they're going through arid zones, they're having to feed livestock. How the heck you manage to do that? And now they're saying it's becoming impossible because all forest vegetation, such as there was, is disappearing with the major changes in climate. Then, here we have a predictive story because we're looking at climate change. I'm sorry, you're going to hear some drilling sound in the background because there's some renovation going on in the complex. We're building our own climate change in the kind of construction we're doing here. This, by the way, is the home, the Yangtze Valley and China, in China, and the Koraput Jaipur region in Odisha are the birthplace of paddy cultivars, meaning the birthplace of rice. Rice strains in this region go back 8,000 years. The Yangtze Valley and here were simultaneously seeing conscious human cultivation of paddy, of rice. There's wild rice, there's brown rice, there's red rice, there's black rice. Yeah, there's black rice and red rice too. All these incredible wealth and diversity, they've finished because now we've brought BT cotton, genetically modified stuff, into that area, destroying the local species at will as it corners all the water and is used with unbelievable amounts of pesticide. We are looking at climate crisis in the making, in the birthplace of rice. If you notice, there is not a single story here which we have tried telling us detached observers. Every one of them is told through the lives of people. Now here is a person who made the switch to cotton and now seriously regrets it and says it's become a headache, but we don't know how to revert. This is part of the challenge in reporting. What are the options people have? What are the options people feel they have? And so on. I'll do this one more story because this is one of the most difficult stories ever done, I believe, on climate. Not that reporting at 19,000 feet was a cakewalk, but this community of fisher women on the southern tip of the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, they are seaweed harvesters. Every morning, they walk from home to office. That's about 400 yards because they walk out of their huts and walk into the sea. They dive into the sea up to 6 meters, up to, well, maybe 4 or 5 meters more commonly. And generally, they hope to do it between 2 and 4 meters. And they collect seaweed. Now, the seaweed you're seeing in the bag on her hand, that produces billions of dollars for global pharma. For the big guys who made another gigantic killing during COVID, right? So these women, they get a pittance, they get a few cents per kilogram of what they cover. I mean, totally in a day, $2, $3 worth. But what they collect produces wealth for billionaires. Now, what interested us about these women was how much they knew and understood of what has happened to the sea in the last 25, 30 years. It's from that same circle of women who said, the fish we now have to find on Discovery Channel, right? So they dive into the sea and collect. What kind of equipment do they have, by the way? They have goggles. That's a new innovation. Now, our photographer, who comes from a similar community of very poor agricultural laborers, dived into the sea with them, stayed in their huts at night, walked into the sea, dived into the sea with them. These fishing community women spend more time in the water than they do on boats because they're actually diving and collecting it. Here, I just want to show you what brilliant photographs in the telling of this story, how much work a reporter photographer put into doing this story. All he had was one. He is from a very poor background himself, this photographer. I predict he will be a world name in a couple of years. He dives, he gets an old GoPro, you know, the first edition of GoPro, dives into the water and starts clicking. Have a look at this. This is 4 to 6 meters below the surface of the sea. She's coming up with the seaweed. I think this is one of the most beautiful shots of working at sea that I have seen in years and years and years. So they tie these bags together of seaweed, and that's the retreat. Because they've gone pretty far out into the sea, they come back on the boat. They go on the boat, dive in. First, they clear what is closest to the coast, then they keep going further. That's after 8 hours of this kind of exhausting work. He's taken the shoal of fish from below the fish. He shot them from below. So, guys, I'll stop sharing there and wind up on what I would say is necessary. There were a couple of more stories, but I think we need some time for discussion. So I'm saying this, that we created, we have one story. We have one story on bugs, on insects. Most journalists are not aware. I'm sure many of you are, but as a rule, most journalists and much of the public are not aware that 75% of crops in the world are dependent on pollinating insects. And those insects are dying rapidly. In the West, you have some attention because the bees are going. And by the way, there are some 20,000 species of bees, okay? Always. In India, our collaboration with the National Center for Biological Sciences, as I said, we work with scientists. We don't just foreground them, and they find our work useful. We find them invaluable. And they have told us 40% of pollinating species in Indian insects are in steep decline, some of them in perhaps irreversible decline. Now think of what that's going to do to a country full of hungry people. There will be food, but it's going to be more and more out of reach of the poor. So here's what I would say. We make our reporters go to the field with 2 cheat sheets. One is the homework to be done before they get into the field. One is what they do in the field. But the stuff that I think can be done before one goes to the field is the following. Classifying your region, the place you're going to do. Number 1, is your region arid, semi-arid, mountainous, coastal, tropical, fragile ecosystem? 2, how is the soil classified in this region? What are the main soil types? And what are the main occupations of the soil and of the water and of the forests? You know, the forest dwellers, the honey producers, the honey collectors more correctly. How is the soil classified? What are the main soil types? What are the main forest types? 3, what is the crop history and patterning of that region? You must aim to acquire a good understanding of the agroecology of the region you are covering before you get down there. 4, what have been the river water tables in that region in the last 40 to 50 years? How many perennial rivers are there, semi-perennial rivers in your region? Are they running dry? If so, why and since when? 5, arm yourself with all the rainfall data that you can find and be prepared on getting into the field to find that the data is obsolete, bad, whatever, but you still need it. 6, have a sense of a collation of the sources of irrigation in the region you're covering. Rain-fed, dams, rivers, ponds, lakes, etc. 7, very importantly, in most of our countries, how much has the availability of water per person dropped in the last 50 years? In India, the drop is frightening, okay? It's just so scary, I won't tell you what it's like. 8, if the borewell technologies have made their appearance, collect borewell data. Incidentally, there is a small town in the south of India called Tiruchengood, the borewell rig capital of the world. Its borewells are operating in 16 African countries, in every state and union territory of India. And I calculate that at a very conservative estimate, the borewell rigs of this one town in India alone are drilling 2 billion feet into the aquifer every single year, and that is escalating. 9, what is the extent of marshlands in your area? 10, what is the extent of forest cover? What are the main kind of trees and forest vegetation that you get? Rainfall, incidentally, there is a very, very useful, one of the few really useful things the New York Times has done on climate. They created a global warming tracker. I have used this for every one of our stories. It tells you in the region you are covering, the data goes back to 1960, and it lets you know how many intense heat days have increased from 1960 to the present year. For instance, how do they define intense heat day? 38 degrees Celsius and above is called intense heat days. In some of those regions I showed you in the stories, those were to begin with warm regions, and the intense heat days has grown by 50 to 60% in 60 years. Yeah. So you need to get the rainfall data, you need to benchmark it, you need to use the New York Times Global Warming Tracker. Look at how many days of heat have grown. One of the photos I showed you, which I didn't have time to go into, was a place called Churu, which in May 2020 was declared the hottest place on the planet at 51 degrees Celsius on those 2 days. But what they never reported to you was that the same Churu had the coldest temperatures 6 months later in the northern plains of India and fell to sub-zero temperatures. Now, there are your stories, these variations, these gaps, these expansions, these collapses. Then you also need to get together your agriculture facts and figures. Which are the main crops of the district? Benchmark, sequence it. What were yields a few decades ago, 1 decade ago and now? Get basic geographical information classified solid. Have conversations with people. Don't go and use that word climate change and prejudge everything. Talk to them about extreme weather episodes. How has rainfall behaved these last few years? You'll get more information than you dreamed of. If you go with them and say, I want to talk to you about climate change, there won't be a lot of talking done. And approach every story with every approach must be human and storytelling. That is our job. That is our job. Make the story more visual. Shoot those videos, shoot those photographs. You saw the kind of pictures we have. Foreground the voices of people. Use scientists, refer to them, use reports, but foreground the voices of ordinary people. People in their voices, in their idioms, they may say things spectacular. You know, like the broadcast told us, maybe we made the mountain god angry. They gave us great headlines anyway. But the point is this, and I end with that. When we say it in our voices, it sounds like a report. When it's said in their voices, it becomes more like storytelling. And I think the challenge of Climate Report is going to be around storytelling. Thank you.